Hey there. Tonight we are following a buried army into a silence that lasted more than 2,000 years. Recently, researchers used advanced AI to merge lidar sweeps, radar slices, drone maps, thermal readings, and old excavation plans from the Qin Mausoleum. And what surfaced was not a simple burial ground at all, but a pattern hidden under clay, dust, and imperial secrecy. A pattern that suggested the soldiers beneath the earth were arranged with a purpose stranger than protection. So, before we settle all the way in, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe if these slow, dark journeys are something you enjoy. Then lower the lights. Loosen your jaw. Let your shoulders drop and allow the room around you to become a little softer, a little dimmer, and a little farther away. I want you to imagine the ground first. Not the museum glass, not the tourists, not the polished documentaries with bright studio voices and tidy graphics. Just the ground. Dry spring earth in 1974, outside Xi'an, in a village where the problem was painfully ordinary. There was not enough water. A few farmers took up their tools and began cutting into the soil the way people always do when life narrows down to one practical need. Water below, effort above. Dust on the sleeves, sun on the neck, the steady scrape of metal, and the mild hope that the next strike would bring relief. Then one blow landed differently. Not the soft crumble of packed earth, not the dull resistance of stone, but a harder, stranger answer from below. A sound that must have felt small in the moment. Just a knock, just a stubborn thing in the dirt. And yet, in that little interruption, an empire began to stir. They dug around it, probably irritated before they were curious. What appeared at first was not grand. It was broken clay, fragments, a piece of a head, the curve of an arm, splintered pottery. It seemed mixed among the debris were bronze arrowheads and bricks of an unfamiliar kind. Useful, perhaps. Odd, certainly. Important, not yet. I have always found that to be one of the strangest comforts in archaeology. History rarely arrives wearing a crown. More often it comes to the surface in pieces, dusty, inconvenient, and easy to misunderstand. The villagers, from what we know, did misunderstand it. And who could blame them? Some fragments were hauled away. Some were sold. One story says a piece of clay was used as a pillow, which is almost too perfect. Really. Imagine resting your head on a broken shard of the first emperor of China and thinking only that it is oddly shaped and rather hard. History has a sense of humor sometimes. A dry one, but still. The turning point came when a local cultural official, Zhao Kangmin, was brought in to inspect the finds. Where others saw rubble, he saw a signal, not a full answer. Not yet, but the first line of a buried sentence. He recognized that these were not random objects. They belonged together. They came from a world with rules, with intention, with labor behind it. His report moved upward through official channels, and from that moment, the quiet well site stopped being a local curiosity and became the mouth of something enormous. When systematic excavation began, the scale of it unsettled everyone. One figure emerged, then another, then a rank, then an entire formation. Life-sized soldiers rose from the dirt in ordered rows, each one silent, each one strangely individual. Their expressions were not identical masks. Their faces differed. Their armor differed. Hairstyles changed from rank to rank. Some stood alert. Some seemed calm. Some carried the reserved heaviness of men, already used to command. Archers, infantry, cavalry, officers, charioteers, horses, all arranged beneath the earth in disciplined lines. What had been mistaken for broken pottery became an army, a real one, in clay. And not a little ceremonial cluster either. Pit 1 alone opened onto a vast field of soldiers spread over roughly 20,000 square meters. Thousands upon thousands of them. If you were standing there with me, at the edge of that excavation, I think the first feeling would not be wonder. Not yet. I think it would be disorientation. Your mind would keep trying to shrink the scene into something familiar, and the scene would keep refusing. Row after row, face after face, clay hands once gripping real weapons, horses frozen in harness, a military force hidden in darkness for over 2 millennia. For much of the modern world, that was the moment ancient China changed shape. Before the discovery, the Qin Empire often lived in the imagination as a severe outline. Important, yes. Famous, certainly. But thinly held in the mind, compared with later dynasties whose art, writing, and monuments seemed easier to picture. Then the Terracotta Army appeared, and suddenly the Qin world was no longer abstract. It had weight. It had posture. It had shoes with patterned soles, armor plates with careful seams, ears shaped by a sculptor who knew exactly what he was doing. The emperor who had once seemed distant became terrifyingly physical through the labor he commanded and the army he carried beneath the ground. The first emperor, Qin Shi Huang. Even his name arrives with a certain hard edge. A ruler who began as a boy king in 246 BC and ended as the architect of a unified China. He standardized writing, weights, measures, roads, and administration. He crushed rival states and built a state powerful enough to reshape the political map of East Asia. That is the official scale of him. The public scale, the textbook scale. But rulers of that magnitude often cast a second shadow, and it is usually longer than the first. Because what kind of man imagines death and then answers it with an army? Not a prayer, not a poem, not a tomb of modest dignity. An army. Thousands of soldiers, bronze weapons, horses, chariots, a full command structure in clay. It tells you something at once. This was not a ruler planning to rest. This was a ruler planning to continue. And that is where the story stops being merely spectacular and begins to feel cold. For years after the initial discovery, archaeologists kept working outward and downward, carefully mapping pits, corridors, and structural boundaries. Each season brought new details, and each new detail made the old picture less simple. The army was not an isolated wonder dropped into the earth like a single jewel. It belonged to a larger design. The pits were arranged with intent. Distances mattered. Angles mattered. The relationship between soldier groups, pathways, walls, and empty spaces mattered. There was administration in the soil, geometry in the burial, discipline even in the silence. That alone would be enough to hold our attention for a lifetime. But in 2025, the story took on a new shape. This is where the modern layer enters, and I want to be careful with it, because the most interesting part is not some cheap machine magic. It is the patience of data. Teams working with lidar, ground-penetrating radar, drone photogrammetry, thermal readings, and magnetometry gathered enormous amounts of non-invasive information from the site and its surrounding areas. On their own, these scans were dense and difficult, the kind of material that can blur into technical fog. So the researchers turned to advanced AI systems trained to compare patterns across archaeology, architecture, geophysics, and known historical layouts. In simple terms, the machine did not discover the tomb for them. It helped them see the buried relationships more clearly. It stitched together radar and surface data into volumetric models. It distinguished masonry from backfill, void from packed soil, old disturbance from deliberate construction. Then it began highlighting shapes that repeated, lines that converged, angles that echoed one another across separate pits. What human teams had studied in sections, the AI could model as one continuous underground plan. And when the underground plan was viewed that way, the old army became stranger. The warriors were not merely buried in convenient military ranks. Their placement appeared to participate in something broader, something mathematically rigid and symbolically charged. Rings, diagonals, inward channels of force, corridors organized not as random support spaces, but as parts of one coherent system. This did not erase the archaeological interpretation of a funerary army, but it deepened it, darkened it, made it feel less like tribute and more like mechanism. Honestly, that is the word that stays with me. Mechanism. Because once you begin to look at the mausoleum as a mechanism rather than a monument, every clay soldier becomes slightly more unnerving. Their stillness changes. The formation no longer feels simply ceremonial. It begins to feel operational, as though the army is doing something even now, even in silence, even in darkness, even while hidden under fields and modern roads and the soft drifting routines of daily life above. And what was it doing? That question was not answered immediately. The data had to be checked, compared, challenged. Researchers overlaid the AI model with old excavation maps and known ritual alignments from the Qin period. They compared spacing and orientation to military fortifications, burial traditions, and cosmological planning used in early imperial China. Some of the results fit expected patterns. Others did not. Some lines seemed too precise to be accidental. Some spaces seemed too carefully sealed to be merely unfinished. Some inward orientations did not behave like a perimeter at all. They behaved like a tension. That is the word I would use. Attention focused toward a center. You can feel the mood changing now. I think we began with discovery, with dust and wonder, and that famous thrill of the first warriors rising from the soil. But once an army stops looking outward and starts seeming to look inward, the whole emotional balance of the site shifts. The question is no longer only whom the army was guarding for. The question becomes what the army was arranged around. And under that question sits the emperor, Qin Shi Huang, who had already spent a lifetime turning vision into force. Qin Shi Huang, whose empire was built on command, obedience, labor, fear, and astonishing administrative control. Qin Shi Huang, who did not simply rule the living world above ground, but began constructing its echo below. The first emperor whose reach extended into roads, walls, writing, law, and punishment. The first emperor who seems to have looked at death and thought not of surrender, but of management. There is something almost childlike in that fantasy, if it were not so severe. To imagine that one could keep governing, keep commanding, keep owning, time after time has ended. Yet that is precisely why the Terracotta Army remains so powerful in the mind. It is not just beautiful or immense. It is intimate with obsession. It lets us stand at the edge of another person's refusal to vanish. Outside, the night would have continued in 1974, just as it does now. Wind moving over fields, dogs barking somewhere in the distance, lamps lit in homes, farmers sleeping after long work. Above, the buried army, ordinary life. Below it, an emperor's will still arranged in rows. If you let yourself settle into that image, it becomes wonderfully quiet. Almost too quiet. Clay faces waiting under dark earth. Bronze points hidden in shadow. 1,000 expressions that no longer speak, and yet seem not entirely done with us. And this is only the threshold of the story, because once the army was uncovered, and once the AI began mapping how its lines and corridors flowed toward a deeper center, another realization emerged. One that made the whole mausoleum feel less like a grave and more like a devouring structure. The soldiers were astonishing, yes, but they were also only the visible edge of something much larger. Something built over decades by countless human hands. Something that may have consumed the very people who made it. We will move there slowly, from the army that stunned the world, to the tomb that may have fed on its own builders. From clay faces in ordered ranks, to sealed corridors, human remains, imperial secrecy, and the first hints that the greatest monument of Qin China may also have been one of its darkest crimes. When the first shock of the warriors begins to settle, another truth rises behind them, heavier and less beautiful. Armies, even clay ones, do not build themselves. Every face in that underground formation implies another face above ground that shaped it, fired it, carried it, positioned it, and then disappeared back into the anonymous machinery of the emperor's will. This is the part of the story that always feels colder to me. A monument is easy to admire from a distance. Labor is what makes admiration tremble. Historical records, later chronicles, archaeological surveys, and the physical scale of the mausoleum all point toward the same grim reality. Qin Shi Huang did not build a tomb. He built a world under the earth, and worlds require populations. Artisans, laborers, prisoners, peasants, transport workers, metal workers, sculptors, brick makers, surveyors, guards, clerks, and overseers. all drawn into a project that lasted for decades. Some estimates place the workforce in the hundreds of thousands. Even if one allows for exaggeration in the old accounts, the surviving evidence still speaks with frightening clarity. This place was raised through mass human strain. Try to feel the rhythm of that for a moment. Not the final stillness of the warriors, but the years before it. Rope dragging timber, clay kneaded by hand, kilns breathing heat into the night, men hauling loads across packed earth until their shoulders burn and their breath shortens, women left behind in villages where sons and husbands vanish into state labor, long lines of conscripts moving toward construction zones with no guarantee of return. The emperor's afterlife began as someone else's exhaustion. The source material pushes this hard, and with reason. Qin's reign was not built on soft persuasion. It was a reign of systems, and systems like his tend to regard human beings the way mills regard grain. Input, pressure, output. Useful while moving, forgettable once spent. By the time the Mausoleum complex was underway in full force, secrecy had become part of its architecture. This was not merely a burial place. It was a concentration of imperial ambition, ritual control, and hidden engineering. Those who worked within its corridors learned too much. They knew passages, traps, shafts, boundaries, and storage zones. They saw the scale. They understood that this was no noble resting place in the ordinary sense. They were inside a secret that would outlive the emperor if allowed to travel by memory. And Qin Shi Huang was not a man who tolerated loose memory. You know that feeling when a person becomes so determined to master uncertainty that they begin destroying anything they cannot fully control. That seems to be the emotional climate of his later rule. Not merely harshness, but a tightening, a hardening, a belief that silence itself could be imposed if one only pushed hard enough. Excavations around the mausoleum have uncovered human remains in troubling contexts. Not arranged as honored burials, not accompanied by ceremony or the grave goods of status. Bones beneath walls, bodies near corridors, human traces embedded in construction zones where no formal interment belongs. Scholars disagree in detail, as scholars should, but many accept that at least some of these remains likely represent laborers or workers who died on site, or were disposed of without dignity after their usefulness ended. The source goes even further, framing these discoveries as evidence of mass execution to preserve secrecy. Whether every dramatic detail will stand or soften under future study, the emotional direction is clear enough. The tomb was not only built by human lives, it was shadowed by human loss from the beginning. And that, strangely, makes the whole army feel sadder. Because the soldiers are magnificent. That is true. But magnificence can be its own veil. Look too long at the craftsmanship, and you may forget the hands that trembled while making it. Look too long at imperial order, and you may miss the suffering hidden inside the neatness of the rows. In 2025, the newer digital surveys reportedly added another layer to this picture. Non-invasive scans and AI-assisted structural mapping highlighted sealed spaces and undocumented subzones where disturbed soil, voids, and density changes suggested more human remains than earlier records had fully described. The source frames these as workers trapped or buried alive inside parts of the mausoleum complex. Not guards, not nobles, just laboring bodies folded into the emperor's final secrecy. Even when one treats such claims carefully, the image is difficult to shake. An underground empire sustained by those who were denied even the dignity of being remembered. And when you place that against the rest of Qin Shi Huang's rule, the pattern becomes even more severe. His empire transformed China. That is the grand sentence, and it is not wrong. Roads, standardization, centralized control, military success, administrative force, the kind of achievements later states inherit even while they recoil from the violence that made them possible. Yet the same ruler who unified also conscripted on a vast scale. Families were uprooted. Prisoners were sent to projects from which many likely never returned. The Great Wall, or at least its early Qin-connected defenses, became a symbol not only of protection but of state appetite. There is that old image, bodies in the wall. It lingers because it condenses a wider truth. Even when not literally confirmed in the most dramatic form, it captures the moral tone of the reign. Human cost did not stop projects. Human cost was part of projects. Stone, tamped earth, timber, labor, death, all folded together under the idea of necessity. That was the atmosphere. Then there are the books. The burning of books and the reported burying alive of scholars may be remembered with some exaggeration across time, but the core memory remains one of the most chilling in all of ancient statecraft. Knowledge itself was treated as a threat if it stood outside imperial control. Competing ideas, rival traditions, inconvenient teachings. These were not merely debated. They were targeted. Imagine the message that sends through a court. It is one thing for a ruler to fear rebellion. It is another for him to fear thought. Once a ruler reaches that point, nothing that knows too much is safe. Not scholars, not alchemists, not officials who report bad news, not workers who have seen the hidden arteries of his tomb. The emperor's fear of death only sharpened everything. As he aged, the practical brutality of his rule seems to have fused with a more private panic. He wanted immortality, not as a metaphor, not as legacy in the poetic sense, but as something literal. He sent expeditions in search of elixirs. He leaned on physicians, magicians, and alchemists. He listened to promises because the alternative was unbearable. And when those promises failed, punishment followed. Disappointment near the throne was dangerous. Bad news was dangerous. Reality itself became dangerous if it contradicted imperial desire. I think that is why the tomb feels less like a funeral structure and more like a psychological landscape. Every corridor is shaped by a fear. Every buried object answers an anxiety. Every layer of protection reflects a mind that could not allow endings to remain endings. If you stand in imagination at the edge of this project while it is still alive with workers, not yet sealed, not yet still, the atmosphere must have been unbearable. Smoke from kilns drifting over packed earth. Supervisors calling out counts. Cartwheels grinding. Clay drying in racks. Bronze being sharpened. Orders moving downward through a chain of command that did not need to explain itself because it could simply punish. And over it all, The knowledge that the emperor, who demanded this city of death, was also the emperor who feared betrayal more than almost anything. Paranoia is such a quiet architect. It begins with protection and ends with entombment. This is why the source's darker claims do not feel emotionally out of place, even when they reach toward the more dramatic edge. If workers were silenced to preserve the tomb, it was entirely consistent with the broader grammar of Qin rule. A court built on fear does not suddenly become gentle at its most secret moment. A ruler who disciplines speech, labor, and thought in life will not become sentimental when managing the architecture of his afterlife. The bones near collapsed corridors, the sealed spaces, the undocumented dead, all of it fits too well. And then there is another layer, one I find especially haunting. The people who built the tomb may have understood more of its true purpose than anyone was meant to admit. They were not only building walls and statues. They were helping assemble a machine of memory and control. Perhaps some believed in it. Perhaps some feared it. Perhaps some simply endured it one more day at a time, too tired to ask what all this clay and bronze meant beneath the earth. That human uncertainty matters, because when we talk about ancient monuments, we often flatten the workers into one faceless mass. But of course they were not faceless at all. They were as individual as the soldiers they made. A man with a cough, a woman with cracked hands, someone thinking of home, someone stealing one extra mouthful of food, someone whispering a rumor that the emperor had gone too far, someone staring at a half-finished warrior and recognizing that he was sculpting not a guardian, but a silence. The source calls the mausoleum a crime scene, and whether one uses that exact phrase or a softer one, the emotional logic is undeniable. This is a place where art and violence share the same soil. The discipline that produced beauty also produced terror. The order admired by later generations was paid for by bodies that vanished under imperial necessity. Even the emperor's search for immortality casts a strange light over the worker's fate. Think of the contrast. One man reaching desperately to escape death. Countless others drawn into the orbit of that fear and made more vulnerable to death because of it. He sent men across seas for remedies. He consumed resources for the impossible. He punished those who failed to extend his life. And all the while the mausoleum grew larger, deeper, more elaborate, more secretive, as if the answer to mortality could be built by multiplying labor and enclosing enough objects within the dark. But death does not bargain in that way. So the tomb becomes a kind of hunger. It eats years. It eats labor. It eats secrecy. It eats memory. It may have eaten its own builders, at least in part. And even if one were to strip away every dramatic flourish and argue for the most restrained reading possible, the result would remain bleak. Decades of forced labor under a ruler defined by control and fear. Mass construction with high mortality. Human remains in contexts of neglect and concealment. A funerary complex whose scale itself implies suffering too large to count neatly. I have always thought there is something especially chilling about suffering that becomes administrative. Not rage in the moment. Not sudden cruelty. Paperwork cruelty. Logistics cruelty. Scheduled cruelty. The kind that unfolds through units, quotas, assignments, transport lists, and work teams. That is what the mausoleum suggests. Not a burst of madness, but a long, steady extraction of human effort under an emperor whose imagination reached farther than mercy. By now, the atmosphere around the buried army has changed again. We began with awe at discovery. Then came the strange inward geometry of the site. Now we are in the labor shadow, where the clay figures feel less like simple marvels and more like survivors of an atrocity made to look orderly. And still, beneath all of this, the central mound waits. The main chamber remains sealed. Historical accounts speak of rivers of mercury meant to imitate waterways. Modern soil testing has indeed found unusually high mercury concentrations around the mound, lending the old descriptions a grim kind of plausibility. Officials have long resisted opening the center because excavation could collapse fragile structures, destroy delicate surfaces, and release toxins into the air. So the heart of the mausoleum remains closed, its full contents deferred into the future. That is where the imagination begins to tighten, because once you accept that the emperor built not only an army, but an entire hidden empire beneath the earth, and once you accept that workers suffered and perhaps died to keep its architecture silent, the sealed center stops feeling like an archaeological inconvenience. It begins to feel like the lock on a door that nobody fully trusts. A tomb can be sealed for preservation. It can also be sealed for fear. And in the next movement of the story, as the underground complex opens wider in thought, we will follow that fear into the empire beneath the earth itself, where soldiers are only one class among many, and where officials, musicians, animals, bronze chariots, and ritual objects suggest that Qin Shi Huang did not merely plan to be buried. He planned to keep ruling, somewhere below, in a state arranged to continue after the breath had left him. The deeper archaeologists moved into the mausoleum complex. The less it resembled a grave, and the more it resembled a city that had simply been persuaded to stop breathing. That may sound dramatic, but honestly, there are moments in ancient history when understatement becomes a kind of dishonesty. A single coffin would have been easier to understand. A chamber of treasure, easier still. But Qin Shi Huang was not content with relics and ornament. He wanted structure. He wanted hierarchy. He wanted procedure. He wanted the shape of rule itself to survive him. So beneath the earth, he assembled not only an army, but an imitation of a functioning state. Imagine the view if the soil could turn transparent for a moment. Not just long rows of warriors in their disciplined pits, but walls and subdivisions, corridors and chambers, outer zones and inner ones, all arranged with the calm severity of administration. Researchers gradually realized that the larger mausoleum was laid out in ways that mirrored the organization of the imperial capital above ground. There were boundaries corresponding to outer and inner precincts. There were specialized sectors. There were places for force, places for ceremony, places for movement, places for display, and places for the machinery of authority. The emperor had not planned to arrive in the next world alone. He had planned to arrive prepared. This is where the story becomes almost eerily domestic in its thoroughness. Inside the larger complex, archaeologists found not only soldiers, but figures representing officials and attendants, men whose clay postures suggest waiting, listening, accounting, advising, It is one of the details I find most unsettling. Soldiers make immediate symbolic sense. Power expects enemies. But officials tell a different story. Officials imply paperwork, audience, command, routine. They imply that the emperor imagined not a brief armed passage through death, but a continued reign complete with bureaucracy. And bureaucracy is such a living thing. It does not belong to monuments. It belongs to mornings, to reports, to seals pressed into soft material, to ledgers and decisions, and the endless neat channels through which authority moves from one room to another. To bury clay administrators underground is to say something very specific. It is to say that the emperor did not imagine death as silence. He imagined it as governance continued by other means. If you were standing there with me at one of those excavated sections, I think the first impression would be restraint. The figures do not shout. They do not perform for the eye the way later royal art sometimes does. They wait. That is the word. They carry the stillness of people who expect orders to resume at any moment. Then there were the entertainers. This is where the underground world begins to feel almost tender before it becomes frightening again. Beyond soldiers and officials, the sight revealed figures of dancers, acrobats, musicians, and performers, as if the emperor had no intention of spending eternity in pure severity. Ritual, spectacle, diversion, movement, all of these were drawn downward into the tomb. Court life was to continue. Ceremonies were to continue. Beauty was to continue, even if only in fixed clay and bronze. It is a strange thing to picture, an afterlife empire in which armed men stand guard while silent performers wait forever to begin. Nearby, researchers found bronze chariots, horses, and carefully rendered equipment. Saddles, bridles, rinds, the little practical details that usually vanish first in grand retellings, all given their due. These were not casual symbols. They were crafted with a seriousness that suggests intended function. Not function in our world, perhaps, but function in the emperor's thinking. A vehicle must be ready. A horse must be held. A driver must stand by. Nothing in this buried state was meant to feel unstaffed. There is something almost moving about that, until you remember who ordered it. Qin Shi Huang did not believe in relinquishing scale. If he had ruled a unified world above, then below he would rule a second one. If he had commanded armies in life, he would not walk defenseless in death. If he had governed through officials, ritual, and surveillance before the grave, then the grave itself would be fitted with the same invisible logic. Once you accept that, the whole site reorganizes itself in the mind. The warriors are not the story. They are one department within the story. Other finds reinforced the same vision. Bronze cranes and ducks were arranged to evoke parks and water gardens. Touches of cultivated beauty placed inside a funerary environment that otherwise might have hardened into pure authority. I have always found these details especially haunting. They suggest that the emperor wanted not just control, but atmosphere. Not merely command, but the texture of life continued. Gardens, creatures, movement. The suggestion of an imperial world still unfolding in ordered calm beneath the ground. Then there is the stone armor, a full suit of it, or rather, a suit too rigid and impractical for an ordinary living body to wear. It has often been described as ceremonial or symbolic, but the very uselessness of it for daily human action is what gives it power. It seems designed for another kind of body, or perhaps for the idea of a body. A spirit equipped for danger. A ruler clothed for a realm where ordinary material needs no longer apply. When the source says these objects were not decorations but tools meant for another order of existence, I understand the instinct behind that language. These things do not feel ornamental. They feel assigned. By this point, the central logic of the mausoleum becomes hard to miss. Qin Shi Huang believed, or wanted others to believe, that his authority would not end with the shutting of his eyes. Death was not retirement. Death was relocation. That helps explain why China has long refused to fully open the central mound. The reasons given are sensible and serious. The chamber is fragile. Excavation could destroy pigments, organic matter, wood, textiles, and structural features before conservation methods can protect them. And then there is the mercury. Ancient historical accounts, especially the later narrative of Sima Qian, describe rivers and seas of mercury laid out inside the tomb to imitate the waterways of the emperor's domain. For years that sounded almost too theatrical to trust fully. One more flourish in a text that knew how to enlarge a ruler through astonishment. Yet soil testing around the mound has repeatedly shown unusually high mercury concentrations. Not a whisper, but a measurable disturbance. Enough to keep the old account alive in the modern mind. Think about the mood that creates. Under a sealed mound, there may be channels of liquid metal, silver and poisonous, arranged as a map of an empire that no longer exists above ground in its original form. Under that same mound lies the ruler who tried to outwit death. Around that ruler stand soldiers, officials, attendants, animals, performers, vehicles, and objects that suggest utility in another realm. The whole thing begins to feel less like a burial and more like a suspended system. A state put into storage. And yet a sealed state is always a little unnerving, because storage implies possible retrieval. This is where the old decades of archaeology met the newer unease of 2025. Non-invasive surveying, when paired with AI analysis, did not simply offer a cleaner map. It offered a more coherent one. Instead of scattered discoveries spread across years and disciplines, the data could be read as one underground composition. Drone imaging helped define the surface geometry of the mound and surrounding pits. Ground-penetrating radar traced subsurface anomalies. Lidar refined the topography. Thermal data identified areas that behaved differently from the soil around them. Magnetometry highlighted metallic or unusual mineral signatures. Then the AI layered it together. That process matters, because the human eye is very good at meaning once meaning has been suggested, but machines are sometimes better at consistency. They can ask, quietly and without fatigue, whether one angle repeats another, whether one corridor echoes a second at mathematically unlikely distances, whether empty space is really empty or only looks that way because no one has yet connected it to the rest. And once those layers were fused, the mausoleum's underground empire seemed even more intentional than archaeologists had already suspected. The army pits were not simply neighboring features beside a royal grave. They belonged to a broader plan whose logic extended inward. Paths seemed to guide the eye and force toward a center. Auxiliary spaces no longer felt random. Hidden zones took on new weight. The old interpretation of a funerary kingdom remained true in one sense, but it no longer felt sufficient in another. This was not just a kingdom for use after death. It may also have been a structure built around a problem at the center of death. I know that sounds like the beginning of legend, but stay with me. We are not yet in legend. We are in mood, in arrangement, in the strange emotional pressure produced when an underground city appears too ordered to be innocent. Some researchers in the source speak of the mausoleum as a mirror of the living capital, and that is exactly right, though mirrors always deserve suspicion. A mirror reverses. A mirror creates distance even while copying shape. A mirror keeps the familiar and removes the warmth. That is what this underground empire does. It takes bureaucracy, court life, military formation, transportation, gardens, and ritual display, then drains them of breath and buries them in stillness. I think that is why the sight is so mesmerizing. It is not merely large. It is complete in a way that feels emotionally unnatural. Human life below ground should fragment, but here it was carefully recomposed. And because it was recomposed, it begins to ask a more difficult question. Was all of this prepared simply to serve an emperor beyond death? Or was some part of it arranged to manage him? That question would remain half-formed for decades. Then the darker theories began to gather around it. Once the center remained sealed, once the mercury remained threatening, once the full geometry of the underground empire seemed more integrated than anyone had first assumed, interpretation could no longer remain comfortably narrow. Historians stayed with evidence, as they should. But folklore, ritual history, and the stranger edges of early imperial belief began slipping into the conversation. If Qin Shi Huang truly expected to rule after death, then what exactly did he expect to rule against? What sort of world required not just an army, but an entire functioning state arranged beneath the earth? That is the threshold we are approaching now. We have walked from the fields of 1974 into the labor shadow of the tomb, and from there into the emperor's buried empire, with its officials, entertainers, vehicles, animals, and poisonous waterways of memory. Everything below the ground suggests continuation, not closure. Yet the same patterns that imply continuation also imply something else, something more uneasy, as if the afterlife kingdom had been built not only for use, but for control. Let yourself walk it slowly in the mind. A corridor under the earth, not narrow exactly, but enclosed enough that the air feels held. Packed soil behind brick, brick behind silence. Somewhere above, the ordinary weather of the world continues. Wind over fields, birds in light, carts on roads, all the little democratic sounds of life. Down here, none of that enters. Only the muffled certainty of arrangement. A clay official stands where he was placed. A bronze bird waits in a garden that no season will ever touch. The emperor's road beneath the earth leads not toward mystery in the abstract, but toward administration without breath. That is what makes the mausoleum so unnerving to me. It is intimate with routine. Death is usually imagined as rupture, but Qin's underground world tries to abolish rupture entirely. It tells every object to keep its post. Keep the horse ready. Keep the papers in order. Keep the performers close. Keep the guards alert. Keep beauty where beauty belongs. Keep the world from noticing that the ruler at the center has crossed a threshold no command should be able to reverse. And the clay itself helps the spell. Fired earth has a patience that stone sometimes lacks. It holds fingerprints, smoothing marks, the memory of pressure. Even now, when one looks at the soldiers and attendants, there is a softness inside the hardness, a sense that hands were once there in long, repetitive contact. Someone shaped these sleeves. Someone pinched these ears. Someone pressed the folds of this robe and then moved to the next figure, and then the next, and then the next, until repetition itself became a kind of burial chant. Work as incantation. Labor as architecture. Touch turned into system. In the next part, the air around the tomb changes again. The historical picture begins to blur at the edges into ritual interpretation. Cosmic war, sleeping soldiers, and the first unsettling possibility that the army's true purpose was never as simple as guarding a dead emperor. It may have been waiting around something, or someone far more dangerous than honor alone can explain. Once a tomb grows large enough, it begins inviting theories the way a ruined house invites weather. Some of those theories are careless, of course. Some are dramatic for the sake of being dramatic. But others cling to a site because the site itself keeps producing emotional pressure that plain description cannot entirely relieve. Qin Shi Huang's mausoleum is one of those places. It has always been easier to describe than to domesticate. You can catalog the warriors, count the pits, measure the mound, trace the corridors, and still feel that something in the design remains inwardly unsettled. That is where the darker interpretations begin. For years, one of the most persistent questions surrounding the Terracotta Army was deceptively simple. What is it really for? Not in the broad museum sense, not as a funerary guard in one sentence, but in the deeper structural sense. Why this exact scale? Why this exact arrangement? Why soldiers in such numbers, with real bronze weapons, ordered in formations that feel less like decorative reverence and more like deployed readiness? Ancient states often bury symbols of power with rulers. That is not unusual. But there is a difference between honoring authority and operationalizing it. The Terracotta Army has always seemed perilously close to the second category. The rows are too disciplined. The ranks too coherent. The details too practical. Even before the 2025 scans, some scholars and many fringe writers had already wondered whether the army expressed more than loyalty, whether it was built with an imagined future event in mind. One of the oldest dark interpretations, repeated in different forms, suggests that Qin Shi Huang believed death itself was not a private transition, but a contested territory. If that sounds strange to us, it would not have sounded nearly as strange inside a world where ritual, cosmology, kingship, and the management of unseen forces overlapped constantly. For a ruler who claimed heavenly sanction, who trusted ceremonies, omens, and control systems in life. It would not be absurd to assume a similar struggle beyond death. The emperor might not have been preparing for peaceful continuation, but for conflict. A war after the body. Not against ordinary rivals, but against powers invisible, ancestral, celestial, or hostile, in ways his court language could not neatly classify. In that reading, the thousands of warriors were not just to accompany him, but to fight for him. They were not memorials. They were reserves. The clay army becomes, under that lens, a force held in suspension for a battle outside the human field. I am not asking you to believe that literally. I am asking you to feel why the idea persisted. Once an emperor has buried an empire beneath the earth, ordinary explanations begin to look a little thin around the edges. Then there are the ritual theories. Qin rule was saturated with the performance of authority. Ceremonies were not soft embellishments to power. They were power made visible, power normalized, power made to seem inevitable and therefore divine. If ritual can confirm legitimacy, then perhaps ritual can also preserve it, extend it, or redirect it beyond death. That is the line of thought that led some interpreters to imagine the Terracotta Army not only as soldiers, but as instruments. Effigies have occupied strange positions in many traditions. They can represent. They can substitute. They can absorb. They can host. They can stand in for bodies, direct attention, confuse, hostile force, or guard a threshold by embodying an intention. In a world where the emperor's court already tied state force to cosmological order, it is not difficult to see how a vast field of clay bodies could be understood as a ritual machine, not merely an image of strength, but strength arranged in material form to act on fate itself. That sounds extravagant. I know. Yet, extravagance is part of the tomb's native language. Chinese folklore, developing across centuries and layered by retelling, adds another shade to this atmosphere. There are stories in many traditions of figures waiting in stillness, not dead in the ordinary sense, but suspended, preserved, delayed. Warriors who sleep rather than end. Guardians who remain inert only until the proper command returns. Once such stories brush against the Terracotta Army, they cling very easily. Thousands of armed figures buried in darkness for more than 2,000 years. Their weapons once sharp, their formation still intact, their purpose still not completely resolved. You can see why imagination refuses to leave them alone. And yet folklore alone is not what changed the tone in 2025. What changed the tone was the marriage of old unease with new imaging. The joint survey described in the source set out, at least on paper, to do something very sober. Build a more complete, non-invasive model of the Mausoleum complex. Lidar swept the surface and shallow subsurface with laser pulses. Ground-penetrating radar sent radio waves into the earth. Drones mapped the mound and surrounding pits from above. Handheld and cart-based systems ran measured grids at ground level. Magnetometry tracked changes in buried material response. Thermal imaging registered stubborn irregularities that ordinary observation could not hold in one view. It was a patient campaign of seeing without touching. The raw output from work like that is rarely cinematic. It comes as point clouds, slices, density maps, layered probabilities, messy returns that need interpretation. So the researchers, according to the source, fed the material into an AI analysis pipeline trained to identify repeating layouts, human-made geometry, voids, construction boundaries, and symbolic alignments across large datasets. In other words, they asked the machine not what to believe, but what patterns the buried structure kept repeating. That distinction matters, because once the AI stitched the lidar, radar, thermal, and magnetic data into one volumetric model, the warriors stopped appearing like isolated archaeological marvels and started appearing like parts of a single design language. Corridors lined up with pits. Pits echoed larger directional systems. Dense zones and empty ones began answering one another across distance. The underground complex became legible as one plan. And then the repeating geometry emerged. This is the point in the story where the mood sharpens. The AI reportedly detected rings, diagonales, radial channels, and convergence lines connecting the army units and their surrounding corridors in ways too mathematically coherent to dismiss as burial convenience. The formation was not random. That much might sound unsurprising, since, of course, imperial construction is planned. But the nature of the planning was what disturbed the team. When they compared the geometry not only against military layouts, but also against known ritual diagrams, fortification schemes, and symbolic patterns from the broader historical record, the strongest resemblance did not point toward a simple defensive perimeter. It pointed toward a sigil. Or, to say it more cautiously, toward a formation whose logic resembled ritual containment more than open military protection. I have always found that phrase, containment, quietly terrifying. Defense suggests danger from outside. Containment suggests danger at the center. To test the model further, the team ran simulations, asking a functional question. If these lines of soldiers, chariots, and archers were behaving like a defensive arrangement, did they orient outward in the way we would expect from a barrier meant to repel intrusion? If they were behaving like something else, how did the directional logic shift? According to the source, the strongest fit was not a wall facing the world. It was a grid converging inward. The army was not looking away from the emperor. It was looking toward him. That is the moment when the old speculative theories and the modern survey begin to lock together in the imagination. Cosmic battle, spirit control, imperial ritual, sleeping soldiers. None of these needed to be literally true for the emotional force of the discovery to strike hard. All that was necessary was the growing impression that the mausoleum's geometry had been designed not simply to serve a dead ruler, but to focus force upon a central point. And beneath or near that point, the scans reportedly found something else. A sealed central void had already begun to emerge in the merged data. A chamber, or chamber-like space, with unusually sharp boundaries and strange signal behavior. Radar scattered there in ways that suggested shielding. Thermal readings did not behave normally. Magnetometry registered a cleaner spike around the perimeter than expected. The source interprets this as evidence that the space was deliberately masked, perhaps with iron-rich or magnetically active material, as though someone had built not just a hidden chamber, but a hidden chamber meant to resist being known. The language becomes difficult there, even for disciplined researchers. A hidden chamber is one thing. A chamber built to hide is another. Orientation studies made the effect still stranger. When the model was overlaid with sky maps corresponding to the Qin era, the long axis of the chamber aligned with the North Star, while corridor lines around it tracked bearings associated with early imperial cosmological planning. Again, that does not prove supernatural intention, but it does prove intention of a different and more sophisticated sort. Heaven and earth were being tied together through buried geometry. The center of the mausoleum was not merely central in a physical sense. It was cosmologically addressed. Then came the solitary figure. Near the hidden central chamber, in a sealed alcove missed by earlier rougher scans, the AI-assisted reconstruction identified a single terracotta statue apart from the rest. Larger than ordinary soldiers, more heavily armored, more complex in build, lacking the familiar rank markers and unit insignia that help sort the standard figures. And most strikingly of all, this figure was turned not outward with the army, but inward toward the deeper passages. No known historical text seems to mention it. That silence is one of the reasons the figure feels so powerful. If it were a celebrated guardian, why no record? If it were an honored general, why no naming? If it were a ceremonial decoration, why seal it away from view? The absence of textual acknowledgement gives the figure a kind of cold gravity. It becomes the thing no one officially wished to describe. Theories multiplied immediately. Perhaps it was a loyal defender immortalized in private. Perhaps it was Perhaps, in a more ritual reading, it was not a person at all in the representational sense, but a vessel, a point of focus, a stationed will. Surface irregularities in the scan suggested the figure may even have been altered after first construction, revisited, reshaped, or recarved. If that is true, then someone changed their mind about its role while the project was underway. That is such an intimate kind of dread. To revise a hidden guardian in the dark because something about the center still did not feel secure. Geophysical data from the alcove also showed signs consistent with ash or burned residue. The source interprets this as evidence of a fire ritual performed before the space was sealed. A dedication, perhaps, or something more binding. Fire has a way of sharpening ceremonies. It transforms closure into finality. If such a rite took place there, before the hidden sentinel and near the chamber it watched, then the emotional meaning of the space deepens further. This was not a casual annex. It was a treated place. A finalized place. A place somebody wanted, locked in function. By now, the prison reading of the tomb begins to take recognizable shape, even before the source states it openly. Soldiers in mathematical formation. Inward lines. A sealed and shielded chamber aligned to the heavens. A lone, inward-facing figure hidden nearby. Mercury acting as a deadly boundary. An emperor whose later life grew increasingly paranoid and whose need for control never softened. Advisors and priests working under fear. Laborers killed or discarded in secrecy. An underground kingdom designed not only to preserve rule, but perhaps to manage it. You can see why the old mood of awe turns gradually to dread. Because if the army were purely a funerary guard, Much of this detail would feel excessive in a ceremonial way. But if the larger system were built to contain a dangerous continuation, then the details begin fitting together with terrible efficiency. The army's scale would make sense. The precision would make sense. The silence in the texts about certain features would make sense. Even the burial of so much human effort into hidden geometry would make a bleak kind of sense. And still, caution matters. Some scholars will insist, reasonably, that the machine may be overfitting pattern where humans are eager to find one. Others will say ritual similarity does not equal ritual certainty. Others will note that emperors align tombs with heavens because power loves the sky, not because they are building cages for their own souls. All of that is fair, but even the cautious reading leaves us with a site whose arrangement keeps directing attention inward, and a central zone whose secrecy feels more active than passive. The darker conclusions almost write themselves once the structure is seen whole. In the next movement, the source stops circling and says the thing directly. The tomb may not have been designed to protect Qin Shi Huang after death. It may have been designed to keep him there. The army may not be his escort, but his containment. The mercury may not be symbolic water, but a moat. The hidden figure may not be an honor guard, but a watcher. And if that is true, then what generations admired as imperial glory begins to resemble something much colder, an eternal cage built by people who feared what their emperor might become if he ever rose again. When the scattered pieces are finally laid beside one another, the image that emerges is no longer magnificent in the ordinary sense. It is severe. It is cold. It is almost embarrassingly logical. The Terracotta Army was not arranged as a field of honor. It was arranged as a system. That is the threshold where awe becomes unease. For half a century, the world looked at the warriors and saw devotion, craftsmanship, imperial confidence, an emperor so determined to carry power past death that he ordered claymen by the thousand to stand with him in the dark. That reading still has force, and I would never pretend it vanishes. But the newer scan results, as the source frames them, keep leaning in another direction. The soldiers do not simply surround the emperor. They direct themselves toward him. The hidden chamber does not simply exist at the center. It appears shielded, aligned, and intentionally obscured. The solitary larger figure does not simply accompany the arrangement. It stands apart, turned inward, as if assigned to watch the place where all the lines converge. At a certain point, the old language of tribute begins to fail, because tribute usually faces the world. Tribute wants to be seen, counted, admired. A prison is different. A prison may imitate honor if it needs to. A prison may dress itself in loyalty and ritual because those are more acceptable masks. But its real logic is inward. Keep the center fixed. Keep the perimeter disciplined. Keep the danger from crossing the line. And if the danger lies in the tomb itself, then every detail begins to harden into purpose. The source puts this as plainly as possible. The Terracotta Army was not built to defend Qin Shi Huang. It was built to contain him. The underground empire was not a reward for power. It was a seal placed around power that had become too unstable to trust. The emperor who had once declared himself the Son of Heaven, who had turned ceremony into obedience and law into fear, may have inspired not only devotion in life, but dread at the edge of death. If those closest to him believed his will would continue after burial, and not in a harmless way, then the mausoleum changes from an afterlife court into a carefully disguised trap. I have to admit, this is the point where the whole site starts feeling less ancient and more psychological. Not because the beliefs are modern, but because the pattern is so painfully familiar. When a ruler becomes too powerful to oppose in public, resistance often moves underground. It hides in procedure. It hides in advice. It hides in architecture. It hides in the small adjustments made by frightened experts who cannot stop the system, but can alter its final shape. That is one of the two theories the source highlights, and it is the darker one. The first theory is easier on the nerves. Qin himself ordered the arrangement, believing he was building invincible protection for his spirit. In that reading, his paranoia simply extended into the tomb. He wanted barriers, soldiers, alignments, poisonous channels, and ritual geometry because he expected enemies in death just as he had in life. The trap-like appearance is, therefore, accidental. A system of protection so intense that from the outside it now resembles imprisonment. That is possible. Quite possible, really. But then comes the second theory. His advisors, priests, or engineers, terrified by what the emperor had become, shaped the mausoleum into a binding structure without ever presenting it that way to him. They told him he was being secured, glorified, immortalized. They gave him soldiers, symbols, and heavenly alignments. Yet the true function of the arrangement, if the prison reading is correct, was restraint. They built a closed geometry around the emperor, not to unleash him, but to prevent his return. There is something bitterly elegant in that idea. A ruler so absolute that no one could oppose him while he lived, yet so feared that the people who served him may have prepared his captivity in the only place left available to them, after death. They could not overthrow him in the daylight of court. They could only bury him inside a machine he mistook for loyalty. Every major detail in the source is dragged back into that logic. The weapons were real, sharpened, and placed in disciplined lines that now appear to orient inward. If the army were honor alone, symbolism might have sufficed. But real bronze points carry a different emotional weight. They suggest readiness. The mercury channels described in the old texts and supported by modern soil anomalies become more than a map of rivers. They become a deadly moat around a center not meant to be crossed. The hidden, solitary statue in its alcove becomes a sentinel, not at the gates of the empire, but at the edge of the emperor's chamber itself. And then there is the spiritual context. Ancient Chinese belief contained concepts of returning force, lingering breath, disturbed spirits, and dangerous dead. The source uses the phrase restored breath to describe the possibility that a bound soul, once released, might return altered, not fully human, no longer governed by the ordinary rules of life and death. Modern science does not share that framework, of course, and yet the emotional power of the old belief matters because the tomb was built by people who may have taken such possibilities seriously. It does not matter whether we believe exactly as they did. It matters whether they did. If priests, engineers, and laborers accepted that certain rulers might remain dangerous after burial, then the extremity of the tomb's precautions stops looking theatrical and starts looking practical, at least within their own cosmology. Why place soldiers in fixed patterns? Why shape the whole complex with such obsessive precision? Why seal spaces so thoroughly? Why surround the mound with poisonous materials that make even modern archaeologists hesitate to open the heart of the site? Why hide an inward-facing sentinel in a private alcove? Why preserve not just an emperor's dignity, but his bureaucracy, his guards, his animals, his roots, his equipment, his whole kingdom in suspended order? Because perhaps they were not preserving a reign. Perhaps they were pinning one down. The thought changes the emotional lighting of everything. The clay officials underground are no longer merely attendants for eternal government. They become part of the apparatus of immobilized rule, figures standing at their posts inside an empire that cannot advance beyond its own boundaries. The entertainers are no longer simply offerings of pleasure. They become details in a world made convincing enough to keep the emperor's spirit occupied. The gardens, birds, chariots, armor, and roads are no longer just luxuries extended into eternity. They become furnishings inside a closed domain, all of it complete enough that the center does not need to leave. I know that sounds almost cruel in its cleverness, and perhaps that is why it lingers so effectively in the mind. If a dangerous emperor cannot be allowed to rise again, then one answer is force. Another is seduction. Give him everything he expects. Give him ceremony, motion, rank, obedience, beauty, military order, official attention, and the map of his world below the soil. Let the cage feel like sovereignty. The source describes this as chains made to look like tribute, and that phrase keeps circling back for me. Chains made to look like tribute. It is the perfect sentence for autocracy. Really. So much of imperial life already works that way. The ruler mistakes fear for love, silence for loyalty, and controlled appearances for truth. Why should the tomb be any different? If his court had spent years telling him what he needed to hear, why would they stop at the edge of the grave? There is also the question of scale. Thousands of warriors, multiple pits, a vast underground plan, central chambers still unopened, poisonous mercury, perhaps, still pooled in channels after more than 2,000 years. It is almost too much for one interpretation to bear. Yet scale itself may have been the point. If the emperor's spirit was imagined as an overwhelming force, then the response had to be overwhelming too. You do not confine a small fear with an empire. You confine an empire with an empire. That is why the prison theory transforms wonder into dread so quickly. It takes what was already astonishing and gives it motive. And motive is where old monuments become intimate. Once motive enters, the Terracotta Army stops being a static marvel and becomes an argument. Someone wanted this. Someone decided the lines should close rather than open. Someone approved the inward force. Someone sealed the hidden alcove and treated the lone figure with special ritual care. Someone either believed or needed others to believe that the emperor at the center required more than guarding. He required management, permanent management. If you stand in imagination above the mound at night, this becomes almost unbearably still. The fields are quiet. The air is cool. Modern roads lie at a respectful distance. Museum lighting glows far off. The ordinary world has resumed its harmless business. Yet under the earth, beneath layers of packed soil, brick, timber traces, collapsed corridors, and sleeping weapons, there may lie not simply a dead ruler, but a ruler wrapped inside the fears of his own court. This is what turns the mausoleum from an archaeological wonder into a moral echo. It is not only about ancient China. It is about what happens when power grows so intense that even its own servants begin planning for its afterlife as a problem. And there is another reason the source's reading has held the mind so strongly. The tomb remains sealed. If the central chamber had already been opened, catalogued, and aired out beneath careful lights, some of the fear would have evaporated into measurement. We would still be impressed, but not in quite the same way. Instead, the heart of the mausoleum remains closed. Mercury still shadows the soil. Structural fragility still discourages direct entry. The AI has given us models, probabilities, alignments, suspicious patterns, but not final tactile certainty. The center remains withheld, and that withheld center allows every dark possibility to keep breathing softly in the background. What if the prison theory is right? What if the army is not merely around the emperor, but pointed at him? What if the hidden figure is not honor, but custody? What if the rivers are not pageantry, but quarantine? For modern archaeologists, these questions remain technical, symbolic, historical. They move through evidence, comparison, caution, revision. But emotionally, and I think this matters in a sleep story, the power of the tomb lies in the fact that the old builders may have feared release more than they valued display. The source finally asks the natural question: what happens if it opens? That question carries two very different moods inside it. One is scholarly. Priceless history may be waiting in the sealed chamber. Textiles, pigments, woodwork, inscriptions, engineering solutions, ritual objects, perhaps even confirmations or corrections to everything we think we know about the first emperor. The other mood is older, more instinctive. Some spaces remain closed because the people who sealed them wanted a thing to stay exactly where it was. That is the mood we will carry forward next. Not panic, not spectacle, a quieter fear. The fear that opening is not always rescue, and that sometimes the most respectful thing history can do is pause at the threshold, look into the dark, and leave the lock untouched for one more night. The fear of opening a tomb is rarely just fear of dust. There is always something more intimate hiding inside it. Fear of damage, fear of disappointment, fear that what survives will be less than legend promised. Fear that what survives will be worse. In the case of Qin Shi Huang's mausoleum, the source turns that unease into the central emotional question. If the seal fails, what exactly are we releasing? Ancient Chinese belief gave one answer, in terms that are difficult to forget. A bound force, if disturbed, could return with its breath restored, but not in the gentle sense of revival. Restored breath meant a presence reanimated after interruption, no longer fully human, no longer properly governed, carrying illness, violence, and misfortune outward from the place of binding. To modern ears, this sounds like myth, and of course it is myth in one sense. But myths tell us where fear has settled most deeply, and the fear here is very clear. Some dead are dangerous not because they are physically active, but because authority itself can linger. That idea suits Qin Shi Huang almost too well. He was not remembered as a modest ruler. He was remembered as a consolidator, a punisher, a devourer of opposition, a man who made the world arrange itself around his will. Even after his death, stories about him do not soften into nostalgia. They retain a hard edge. Paranoia, control, cruelty, immortality, obsessions, the destruction of books, the silencing of scholars, forced labor on a scale large enough to leave scars in history itself. If a culture were going to fear a ruler's continued presence after burial, this is exactly the kind of ruler it would fear. The source is careful to note that modern scientists do not accept the old spiritual framework. They do not speak of cursed breath or imperial souls straining upward through mercury and clay. Yet they still do not open the central chamber. That contradiction is where the story acquires its finest chill, because the refusal to open the tomb has practical reasons, real ones, serious ones. Collapse, contamination, conservation limits, toxic mercury, the danger that fragile relics, lacquer, pigments, wood, textiles, and biological traces would begin deteriorating the instant air entered spaces that have remained sealed for more than 2,000 years. Archaeology has already learned this lesson the hard way elsewhere. Open too quickly, and the act of discovery becomes the act of destruction. That alone is enough to justify caution. But then the AI results add another layer, and the emotional argument shifts. If the army's geometry forms a containment system, if the central chamber is shielded, if the inward-facing sentinel was placed to watch the center rather than guard the perimeter, then disturbing the structure risks more than simple loss of artifacts. It risks undoing the logic of the tomb. In spiritual terms, that means breaking a seal. In symbolic terms, it means dismantling the very system that gave the mausoleum its coherence. In psychological terms, it means waking an old fear that ancient builders may have worked very hard to bury. I think that is why the source's final movement feels so effective. It understands that you do not need to believe literally in an emperor's returning spirit to feel disturbed by the possibility. You only need to recognize that many people involved in the tomb's making may have believed some version of it themselves, or at least believed enough to build as if the danger were real. And building as if a danger were real is one of the most revealing things human beings do. It is why castles have moats, even in peaceful years. Why vaults have multiple locks. Why rituals multiply around uncertain thresholds. Why rulers surround themselves with ceremony when force alone no longer feels secure. The tomb may not prove supernatural fear in the modern sense, but it certainly records extreme precaution. Precaution in architecture. Precaution in secrecy. Precaution in burial geometry. Precaution in poison. Precaution in silence. That kind of precaution leaves an emotional residue. Suppose for a moment that the prison interpretation is right, or right enough. Then the sealed mound is not simply covering a dead emperor's treasures. It is maintaining a long-held arrangement between fear and authority. The army holds. The corridors hold. The mercury holds. The hidden sentinel holds. The center remains closed, and the world above continues as if none of it matters. A road here, a museum there, tour groups, school children, vendors, photographs. But under all of that, the old system stays in place. And now, imagine interfering with it. Not with bad intention, not out of greed, necessarily, simply out of the ancient modern urge to know. Drill, open, ventilate, lower sensors, deeper, cut through a sealed barrier, touch a chamber not meant to feel moving air. The source asks whether that act would give us priceless history or break the only thing holding a dangerous force in place. In scholarly language, the dangerous force might be toxic mercury, collapsing architecture, or irreversible contextual damage. In mythic language, it might be the emperor's bound continuation. The beauty of the question is that both readings produce the same practical emotion. Hesitate. It is such a rare and useful word. Hesitate before power. Hesitate before disturbing systems whose makers believed they were necessary. Hesitate before assuming that every sealed thing is simply waiting for us as a gift. The modern world trains us toward access. Everything can be opened, mapped, digitized, reconstructed, explained. Yet the tomb of Qin Shi Huang stands there as a kind of ancient refusal. Not yet. It says, not with the tools you have, not with the confidence you bring, not without cost. And perhaps that is why it remains so magnetically alive in the imagination. It has not become past in the tidy way many sites do. It is still negotiating with the present. The source pushes this even further by framing the tomb as a barrier not only around a body, but around an entire mode of rule. If Qin Shi Huang's spirit, or the symbolic force of his reign, were ever to break outward from the center, what would that mean? In old belief, it would mean plague, violence, and catastrophe. In historical language, it might mean the resurfacing of a political logic the tomb already preserves with almost unbearable clarity. Absolute rule, administrative cruelty, ritualized obedience, fear disguised as loyalty, human life spent as building material, a ruler who mistakes his own continuity for cosmic necessity. That pattern, sadly, never vanished from history. Maybe that is why the source's final dread feels more contemporary than supernatural. The fear is not only that the emperor might rise. The fear is that the kind of authority he embodied never really stays buried. It returns under new names, with cleaner clothing and brighter rooms. But the structure remains recognizable. Control everything. Silence dissent. Treat knowledge as threat. Consume labor. Build monuments to endurance. Call it order. So when the source says some rulers were never meant to rise again, The sentence lands twice. Once in folklore, once in politics. And the sealed tomb, patient under the earth, becomes a metaphor without losing its archaeological reality. That balance is what makes the story so effective for sleep. It drifts between literal chamber and symbolic chamber, between poison and curse, between buried emperor and buried pattern. You do not have to choose one completely over the other. You only have to feel how calmly the ancient and the modern can look at the same sealed thing and both decide, perhaps wisely, to leave it alone a little longer. There is also something quietly moving in that restraint. Not cowardice, not superstition in the cheap sense. Respect. Respect for fragility. Respect for context. Respect for the fact that some truths survive precisely because no one has rushed in to tear them into the daylight. The emperor wanted permanence. In a crooked way, he achieved it. Not the permanence of personal immortality, but the permanence of a question that cannot be fully answered without risking the very material that keeps the question alive. What happens if it opens? The source ends by letting that question remain suspended, and I think that is the right choice. A story loses some of its power when it pretends certainty where only pattern exists. What we know is enough to trouble us. A buried empire beneath the earth. A clay army aligned with unnerving precision. A hidden central chamber. A solitary inward-facing figure. Mercury. Human remains. A ruler whose life already made fear rational. AI models that do not give us fantasy, but geometry. And geometry that seems to tighten around the emperor rather than celebrate him outwardly. That is enough. Enough to understand why the tomb still resists opening. Enough to understand why the old spiritual language clings. Enough to understand why this is not merely a story about discovery, but about the ethics of discovery. Enough to understand why the emperor's own people, if the prison theory holds any truth, may have solved the problem of tyranny not by defeating it in life, but by arranging its eternity very carefully after death. I picture them sometimes in the last phase of construction, not as faceless labor alone, though there was so much faceless labor, but as a few knowing minds somewhere within the project. Priests, perhaps. Engineers, perhaps. Advisors, perhaps. People too frightened to speak plainly and too intelligent not to act at all. Looking at plans in low light, listening to orders, adjusting alignments, positioning the sentinel, accepting the fiction of honor while shaping the fact of restraint, telling themselves that if the emperor must descend below, then below must be built in such a way that he does not return unchecked. It is a sad kind of victory, if it is victory. The ruler gets his army. The court gets its seal. The workers get silence. The earth gets the burden of holding everything together for 2,000 years. Then generations pass. Dynasties rise and fall. Languages shift. Scholars arrive. Farmers dig a well. Broken clay appears in the light. A local official recognizes the first tremor of significance. Excavators open the army to the world. Museums glow. Cameras linger on the calm faces of archers and generals. Children stare into glass cases and feel old history looking back. and all the while the center stays shut. That is the most elegant part of the whole design. The emperor's greatest secret remains also the site of his greatest uncertainty. Did he mean to rule there forever? Did his advisors mean him to stay there forever? Is the army escort, prison, or both? Does the hidden figure guard him, or guard us from him? Are the rivers of Mercury only imperial vanity made toxic, or a genuine moat in ritual form? Does the old fear belong only to the dead, or does it still belong to us because we keep making rulers who long to outlive all restraint? The source leaves these as open questions, and I will too. But as the fire in our imaginary room burns lower, and the field above the mausoleum cools beneath a modern sky, I think the deepest unease comes from something very simple. The people who built the tomb may have understood power better than we want to admit. They may have known that some systems cannot be trusted to stop themselves. They may have known that ritual and architecture can sometimes do what courage in daylight cannot. They may have known that when a ruler demands loyalty beyond death, the gentlest answer available is to give him everything he asked for, but arrange it so that he never truly leaves. Now let the image settle into stillness. The buried army beneath the earth, the hidden chamber beneath the mound, the sentinel in its alcove, the old poison lying quiet, the modern scans glowing on laboratory screens, scholars leaning over data, machines tracing lines in darkness, and beneath all of it, the emperor at the center, whether only bone and memory now, or something symbolically heavier, held inside a design so patient that it has outlasted empires, revolutions, ideologies, and generations of curiosity. That patience is the final mood of this part of the story. Not panic, not spectacle, patience. The tomb has waited through war and weather, through dynasties and republics, through shovels, reports, museums, and AI models. It can wait longer, and perhaps that is the most unnerving comfort of all. Whatever lies at the center does not need to hurry. It has already won the oldest contest. It has remained. Soon, when you ask for the final two parts, we can let the whole story widen one last time, from tomb and emperor to the meaning people have drawn from this buried system, what it says about power, fear, control, and why some ancient structures feel less like ruins than warnings written in clay and silence. By the time we reach the outer edge of this mystery again, the tomb has stopped feeling like a single archaeological site and started feeling like a lesson that history kept trying to whisper until technology finally gave it a clearer voice. That, I think, is why the AI angle matters so much here. Not because a machine somehow created the mystery, and not because it replaced scholarship, but because it revealed relationships that had been sitting quietly in the ground, waiting for enough patience to be seen all at once. The lidar points, the radar slices, the thermal irregularities, the magnetic disturbances. All of that was there, in pieces. Human researchers gathered it. Archaeologists preserved the site. Historians provided the records. Ritual specialists offered comparisons. Engineers examined structure. Then the newer systems pulled those fragments into one picture and asked a very old question in a very modern way. What is this place actually doing? And the answer, or at least the answer the source leans toward, is not comforting. The mausoleum may be a burial, a monument, a memorial, and a political theater all at the same time. But if the AI-driven pattern analysis is even partly right, it is also a control mechanism. It is architecture designed not merely to honor authority, but to hold authority in place. That distinction changes everything, because it means the tomb is not only about Qin Shi Huang's ambition, it is also about the fear his ambition produced in other people. This is where the story becomes larger than ancient China. Every age tells itself that power is safest when it is centralized, orderly, unquestioned, and wrapped in ritual dignity. Every age has its own polished language for obedience. Empire, security, harmony, destiny, necessity. The words change. The tone becomes more sophisticated. The documents become cleaner. Yet the old pattern survives with a stubborn little heartbeat. One will at the center. Many bodies arranged around it. Information controlled. Dissent punished. Labor consumed. Beauty employed as camouflage. Ceremony standing in for consent. If you look back over everything we have walked through in these parts, that pattern sits there almost too clearly. The emperor builds not only a grave, but an empire under the ground. He fills it with soldiers, officials, entertainers, animals, vehicles, and symbols of continuity. He pulls life downward and orders it to remain useful after death. Around the heart of that system, according to the new scan interpretation, geometry closes inward. A hidden chamber is shielded. A solitary sentinel faces the center. Mercury waits like a ring of warning. The whole design begins to resemble an answer to a problem so serious that no one dared name it aloud. How do you restrain a ruler who cannot bear to be restrained? That is not just an archaeological question. That is a permanent human question. Honestly, I think that is why this particular story lingers so well at night. Darkness makes systems easier to feel. During the day, the Terracotta Army is spectacle, tourism, exhibitions, glass cases, magnificent craftsmanship, schoolbook history. At night, or at least in the quiet imagination of night, the army becomes what arrangement always becomes when the lights lower. A sign that someone cared desperately about what might happen if order broke. And maybe that is the most useful thing the AI scan did in 2025, at least in narrative terms. It returned fear to the site. Not cheap fear. Not jump scare fear. Not silly cinematic fear. A colder one. Administrative fear. Ritual fear. The fear of planners and advisors and engineers who see danger long before the crowd does, and who answer danger not with speeches, but with layout, concealment, alignment, barriers, and silent lines of force. That kind of fear leaves fewer dramatic traces, but it often builds the structures that outlast everything else. There is a phrase in the source that stays with me. Even after the prison theory, even after the hidden sentinel, even after the thought of the emperor sealed inside a kingdom made to look like his own triumph. The phrase is that the tomb may have been designed to keep his influence underground. Influence. Not merely body, not merely relics. Influence. What does it mean to bury influence? You cannot do it with soil alone. Soil only covers. Influence moves through memory, law, stories, rituals, institutions, habits of obedience, and the deep grooves power leaves inside the imagination of a people. To bury influence, you need a counter-design. You need a structure that says, here, no farther. You need the image of authority enclosed within a stronger frame than authority built for itself. If that sounds too abstract, return for a moment to the warriors. Thousands of them. Individual faces. Distinct hairstyles. Armor folded in clay. Archers. Infantry. Cavalry. Chariots. Real bronze weapons once capable of very practical harm. Rows so disciplined, they feel as though breath might resume at any moment if the wrong command entered the chamber. For decades, they were seen mainly as proof of imperial grandeur. Then the scans nudged the eye inward, and suddenly, the same formation could be read differently. Not a fan opening outward, a hand closing. There is something almost sorrowful in that shift, because it means the artisans who made these warriors may have been serving two masters at once. The emperor who demanded visible glory, and the hidden fear that may have shaped the glory into restraint. Every clay soldier then becomes double. Honor and warning. Tribute and chain. Obedience on the surface. Containment in the design. And the hidden figure near the center, the larger one, nameless in the records, altered perhaps after first construction, darkened by what may have been ritual fire. That figure feels like the purest symbol of the whole story. Not because we know exactly what it was, but because we do not. It stands at the hinge between explanation and silence. General, sentinel, vessel, guardian, jailer. All of those words hover around it, and none settle entirely. Which is fitting, because ancient systems of power often work hardest to keep their real mechanisms unspoken. The same is true of the Mercury. For years it lived half inside historical account and half inside disbelief. Then the soil testing refused to let it fade. High readings remained. The old descriptions of rivers and channels gained a second life. Whether they were purely symbolic waterways or a genuine toxic moat, the effect is the same. Crossing into the center was meant to be difficult, dangerous, perhaps fatal. The tomb does not invite intimacy. It tolerates distance. That distance, strangely enough, has preserved the mystery better than any careless excavation could have done. So we stand in a curious place. We know more than the farmers who first struck clay with a shovel in 1974. We know more than the first local officials who realized the importance of the fragments. We know more than the early years of excavation could possibly have offered, because our tools have grown subtler. AI can now compare, merge, and model at scales no single human eye can hold. Yet, the more we know, the less confidently innocent the tomb appears. Knowledge has not domesticated the site. It has sharpened it. That is another reason this story matters beyond the mausoleum itself. It reminds us that better tools do not always make the past gentler. Sometimes they make it more exact. Sometimes a laser pulse, a radarico, or a machine-learned pattern simply removes the comforting blur that allowed us to stand too close without shivering. The source widens further by implying that what the mausoleum preserves is not only one emperor's burial strategy, but a template for how civilizations cope with dangerous authority. If a ruler cannot be opposed in life, perhaps he can be framed in death. If force cannot check him publicly, architecture might check him privately. If fear cannot speak, geometry might speak in its place. It is such a human solution, really. Indirect, careful, exhausted, intelligent. The work of people who know that survival sometimes depends on saying yes in words and no in design. I find that idea both chilling and oddly tender. Chilling, because it suggests a court so frightened of its own ruler that even the tomb became an act of quiet resistance. Tender, because it means someone, somehow, still cared about the world after him, still cared enough to imagine that his power should not move freely beyond the grave, still cared enough to place soldiers, walls, poison, symbols, and perhaps even a nameless watcher between the emperor and whatever came next. And now the whole story folds back into the present. Researchers run models. Historians argue. Conservators insist on patience. Officials refuse reckless excavation. Visitors stare at the warriors and feel ancient craft moving through their bones. Some hear only history. Some hear only legend. Most hear a little of both. But under all of those responses lies the same final unease. The tomb is not finished with us. Not because anything supernatural is reaching outward in a literal sense, but because the structure keeps asking its old question in modern rooms. What do people build when they are no longer trying to praise power, but to survive it? That question has not aged at all. We live in a world that still creates giant systems around concentrated authority. We still use ritual language to soften command. We still let beauty distract us from labor beneath monuments. We still discover, often much too late, that the official explanation of a structure is not always its truest one. Sometimes the thing built as protection is also a prison. Sometimes the object displayed as loyalty also records fear. Sometimes an empire's most honest statement is hidden in the layout no one was supposed to read as a whole. That is what the AI helped uncover here. Not a ghost. Exactly. Not a simple secret chamber treasure story. A pattern. A pattern of force, obedience, dread, concealed, and restraint. The sort of pattern that makes ancient history feel less remote than we would like. And so, as the fire beside us burns lower, the warriors wait where they have always waited. The emperor remains under the mound. The hidden chamber remains sealed. The sentinel remains turned inward in our imaginations. The mercury remains quiet in the soil. The models remain lit on modern screens. And history, patient as clay, continues whispering that power which demands eternity often leaves behind people desperate to limit how far that eternity can reach. In the final part, we can let everything soften without losing the darkness. We can step back from the prison theory, from the scans, from the sealed center, and let the whole buried army become what it has always been at the edge of sleep. A warning, a wonder, and a silent field of faces waiting for us to decide what kind of order we ourselves are willing to build, and what kind we should leave undisturbed beneath the earth. Let the scene widen one more time. Above ground, morning tourists move in gentle currents, shoes on paved paths, cameras lifted, museum labels read, children whispering louder than they mean to, the ordinary tenderness of public history. They see the faces, the rows, the elegance of repetition. They see the emperor's will translated into fired clay. What they do not immediately see, and what perhaps no one could see clearly before the newer models, is the inward pull of the whole design. The way a monument can smile outward while its true energy bends toward a center hidden from daylight. That is such an old imperial trick. Display one meaning, enact another. Even the discovery story carries that doubleness. Farmers dig for water and strike fragments of a buried army. A local official understands the fragments are not junk. Archaeologists uncover marvels. The nation gains one of the great finds in human history. All of that is true, but running beneath it is another truth, quieter and less marketable. The more carefully we uncover the emperor's afterlife world, the more it begins to look like the work of people who did not entirely trust the man it was built for. And perhaps trust is the real center of this tomb, or rather the absence of it. Qin Shi Huang did not trust scholars. He did not trust laborers. He did not trust criticism, delay, uncertainty, mortality, or the limits that normally instruct a human life. Why should anyone near him have trusted what he intended to become after death? Why would such a court build with innocence? Why would such a ruler be buried in simplicity? He would call for total security. They, perhaps, would hear total danger. Between those two desires, the mausoleum would take shape, grand enough to satisfy him, controlled enough to reassure them, at least a little. If that is true, then the tomb is not merely about one dead emperor. It is a negotiation preserved in earth. One side demanding endless continuation, the other side permitting it only within walls. Symbols, poison, and lines of clay that never relax. Now the story begins to slow, the way embers do when they stop reaching upward and settle into their own small red thinking. We have followed a line from dry farmland in 1974 to clay fragments in a village, from those fragments to an army under the earth, from that army to a buried empire, from the buried empire to a hidden chamber, from the hidden chamber to the darker suggestion that all of it, the soldiers, the officials, the entertainers, the bronze birds, the Mercury, the sentinel in its alcove, may have been arranged not simply to glorify Qin Shi Huang, but to hold him where his own people believed he must remain. That is a long path to walk in the dark. So let us sit with it gently now. The Terracotta Army has always inspired amazement because it is so visibly human in its making. Even at its most intimidating, it is still clay shaped by hands. Thumb pressure in folds, tools scoring armor, faces formed one after another with enough individuality to make the whole field feel populated rather than repeated. This matters, especially at the end of a story like this, because it reminds us that beneath every imperial project lie ordinary makers, people who carried soil, mixed material, fired sections, transported weight, followed orders, feared punishment, and perhaps whispered their own private thoughts where no supervisor could hear. That human layer is easy to lose when the emperor becomes the center of the narrative. But I do not think we should lose it tonight. In fact, I think it is the key to why the story finally becomes restful instead of only disturbing. Because however immense the mausoleum was, however absolute the emperor's will may have seemed, the tomb still depended on human hands. Hands that may have obeyed. Hands that may also have adjusted, hidden, corrected, aligned, and encoded meanings the ruler himself never fully controlled. There is something quietly comforting in that. Not comforting in the sense that history becomes kind. It does not. The labor was brutal. The secrecy was cruel. The cost in lives was immense. But comforting in the sense that, even inside a system built on fear, human intelligence remained active. Human caution remained active. Human resistance, if resistance is the right word, remained active. If the prison interpretation has any truth in it, then somewhere inside the vast obedience of the project, someone still found a way to build a limit around power. And limits matter, perhaps more than monuments do. When I think about the AI scans in that light, I do not imagine cold machines replacing wonder. I imagine them acting almost like patient lanterns. Modern researchers gathered the data. Archaeologists preserved the walls, the pits, and the fragile context. Historians supplied records from the Shiji and later traditions. Specialists in ritual diagrams, architecture, and early imperial cosmology offered comparisons. Then the AI systems took all those scattered lights and made one steadier beam. They did not invent the center. They illuminated the center's relationships. That is what made 2025 feel unsettling in the source. Not because something supernatural was suddenly proven, but because arrangement itself became impossible to ignore. The warrior's geometry, the inward lines, the hidden chamber's orientation, the magnetic masking, the solitary figure, the old Mercury reports, returning with new seriousness. Pattern layered over pattern until the tomb stopped feeling like a pile of fines and started feeling like one deliberate sentence. A sentence written in clay, soil, poison, and silence. And what does that sentence say? Maybe it says, the emperor expected to rule beyond death. Maybe it says his advisors expected trouble if he did. Maybe it says both at once. Maybe that is why the mausoleum feels so charged. It is not a simple object of one intention. It is a compromise between competing intentions, ambition and fear, reverence and management, display and concealment. A court says yes to the emperor's afterlife dream. The structure says yes, but only here, only within this geometry, only under these conditions, only below ground. That kind of double meaning is the true native language of power. It is why the site does not grow simpler when studied. It grows richer and stranger. Every answer breeds another edge of doubt. The clay officials underground are signs of eternal governance. Yes, they are also signs that the emperor's world had to be recreated in enough detail to keep its center occupied. The bronze birds are symbols of beauty. Yes, They are also furnishings in a sealed domain. The sharpened weapons are military honor. Yes, they are also suspiciously practical for a system that may have been meant to hold force inward. Even the mercury is double: decoration and deterrent, river and warning. You know that feeling when a room looks beautiful at first glance. Then, after a minute, you notice that every chair faces one corner, and no one has explained why. That is what the mausoleum became after the newer scan interpretations. The beauty remained. The skill remained. The wonder remained. But the direction of attention changed. And once it changed, it could not quite be changed back. I think this is why the story fits the sleep form so well. It is not really about a jump in the dark. It is about a slow recognition, a soft tightening, the realization that grandeur and fear often inhabit the same architecture, that what dazzles us in daylight may reveal a second purpose in stillness, that some of the most revealing truths in history are not hidden behind secret doors, but in patterns too large to notice until enough patience has gathered around them. And patience has gathered here in extraordinary amounts. 2,000 years of burial, half a century since discovery, decades of excavation, conservation, argument, and careful refusal to break the mound open. Years of technology becoming precise enough to read what the ground had been quietly holding. The emperor wanted permanence, and permanence is exactly what he received, though not in the triumphant way he might have imagined. His army remains. His mystery remains. His unresolved relationship with death remains. His possible imprisonment remains in theory, never fully provable, never fully dismissible, still working softly at the edges of modern thought. There is a lesson in that, too. Authority can build enormous things. It can command labor, standardize form, move mountains of soil, and fill the dark with versions of itself. But it cannot fully control how later ages will read what it leaves behind. Qin Shi Huang may have intended glory alone. If so, the tomb has outlived his script. Others may have written into the structure as well. Planners, priests, engineers, frightened servants of the state, people whose names did not survive, but whose arrangements may have. The buried army therefore becomes not just an imperial statement, but a contested one. A monument with more than one authorial breath still trapped in it. That thought lets the whole sight soften at the very end. Not because the darkness disappears. It does not. The human remains near corridors still matter. The forced labor still matters. The cruelty still matters. The possibility of a hidden trap like logic still matters. The AI findings, even treated cautiously, still matter. But beyond the emperor's shadow, there are also the unnamed many, the workers, the observers, the careful minds who may have shaped one final answer to dangerous power and then sealed that answer where only time could preserve it. Perhaps that is why the buried army feels so calm despite everything. The faces do not contort. The ranks do not break. The whole field stands in disciplined stillness. It is the stillness of work completed. Yes, but perhaps also the stillness of a task that was considered necessary. Hold the line. Keep the center closed. Let the ruler remain where history placed him. Let the upper world continue. And the upper world did continue. Dynasties rose. Dynasties fell. Scholars copied and argued. Armies marched. Children were born into completely different ideas of order. Fields were plowed above the buried army. Wells were dug. Clay was mistaken for rubble. Then the old system returned to light in fragments, then in rows, then in full astonishment. The emperor resurfaced not through restored breath, but through archaeology, not through supernatural release, but through curiosity. Yet even that return remained incomplete. The center stayed sealed. History allowed the outer army to speak, but not the heart. Maybe that is the right rhythm. Some truths can be approached in circles. Outer pit first, then corridor, then pattern, then theory, then silence again. Sleep works that way too. You do not arrive at rest in one hard step. You circle it. You loosen. You pass the same thought more gently each time until it no longer needs defending against wakefulness. So let this final circle be a quiet one. Picture the emperor's mound under evening light. The broad earth, almost ordinary from a distance. The museum structures and walkways resting nearby. Far below, the army in its pits, rank after rank. The officials in their stations. The birds in their still garden. The hidden chamber at the center. The sentinel turned inward. The old Mercury perhaps sleeping in its channels. Above, modern instruments have come and gone. Drones, radar carts, laser sweeps, screens full of points and densities, human voices comparing models, researchers leaning over data with the same mixture of excitement and caution that always attends the edge of real discovery. Then imagine all of that slowly quieting. The screens dim. The researchers go home. The visitors leave. The paths empty. Night settles across the site. Wind moves lightly over the ground. Nothing rises. Nothing breaks the seal. The buried army resumes its oldest activity, waiting without motion. There is peace in that image, even with its darkness. A warning can also be peaceful when it is heeded. Perhaps the mausoleum endures because no one has been arrogant enough to force a final answer too quickly. Perhaps the patience of archaeologists and conservators is itself a kind of wisdom, a modern version of the ancient restraint the prison theory imagines in the builders. Do not open what you cannot yet protect. Do not disturb what you do not fully understand. Do not assume that access is the same as mastery. Those are good rules for history. They are also, in their own way, good rules for sleep. Not every thought needs to be solved tonight. Not every sealed chamber in the mind needs to be opened before dawn. Some things can remain quietly held. Some mysteries do their best work when left intact a little longer. Some rulers, ancient or symbolic, do not need to rise every time memory stirs. So now let the army remain where it has stood for centuries. Let the emperor remain at the center of his earthbound kingdom. Let the sentinel keep its watch. Let the Mercury lie still. Let the AI models rest with their illuminated patterns and unanswered suggestions. Let history keep its patient hand over the mound. and let yourself drift a little farther from the sharp edge of the question. You have followed the data and the legend together. You have stood in the field where farmers once struck clay by accident. You have walked among warriors, shaped for an emperor's eternity. You have looked inward toward the hidden chamber. You have listened to the possibility that the whole underground empire was built not merely as honor, but as restraint. You have let that possibility widen into something larger, a meditation on power, fear, human intelligence, and the careful ways people try to survive authority when they cannot confront it directly. That is enough for one night. The tomb will still be there tomorrow. The army will still wait. The sealed center will still resist certainty. And the long, quiet logic beneath the earth will remain exactly where it has always been. Patient, buried, and listening to the centuries pass overhead like soft weather. Now the fire is low. The room is dim. The last of the old clay dust has settled in the mind. Breathe slowly. Let the emperor stay in his underworld of soldiers and silence. Let the lock remain unbroken. Let the field above him darken into a calm, untroubled plain, and let the only thing rising now be sleep itself, gentle, ordinary, and blessedly free of empire. One last image before we close it all. A single clay face in the half-light of a museum hall. Not the emperor. Just one soldier among thousands. The expression calm, unreadable, almost patient. The mouth closed. The eyes fixed somewhere beyond the glass and beyond us. That face has outlived the dynasty that ordered it, the hands that shaped it, the court fears that may have arranged it, the buried workers, the old priests, the chronicles, the revolutions, the wars, and now even the first shock of modern discovery. It has become something simpler and deeper than any one theory. A witness, quiet enough to carry many meanings without collapsing into one. That is the final mercy of the Terracotta Army. It does not force belief. It only keeps watch while we decide what kind of past we are looking at and what kind of future we are building above it. Good night,